David spares King Saul in King Saul's last days. King Saul was trying to kill David to prevent him becoming the next king of Israel. David fled to hide in a large cave at Adullam, where his family came to join him. 400 men who were either in distress, in debt, or discontent came to support David. Near to Adullam was the town of Keilah. Philistine raiders were attacking the town to steal grain. When David found out, he asked God whether he should attack the Philistines. The Lord answered, "Go attack the Philistines and save Keilah." David and his men inflicted heavy losses on the Philistines and saved the people of Keilah. King Saul was told that David was in Keilah, and he thought he had him trapped. David learned that Saul was plotting against him. He asked Abiathar the priest to inquire from God whether Saul would attack Keilah and whether its citizens would hand him over to Saul. The Lord replied that Saul would attack Keilah and David would be handed over to him. So David moved to the wilderness strongholds around Ziph. Saul searched for David but did not find him. While David was at Horesh, Saul's son Jonathan secretly paid David a visit without letting his father know. "Don't be afraid," Jonathan told David. "My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You shall be king over Israel, and I will be second to you." The two made a promise before God and went their ways. The local Ziphites went to Saul at Gibeah to report David was at the hill of Hikler near Horesh. Saul told them to keep a close watch on David's movements and keep him updated. Saul and his army went down to the desert of Moan, where David was last seen. As Saul approached one side of the mountain, David and his men were on the other side, hurrying to get away. At the moment Saul was closing in on David, a messenger appeared. "Come quickly, the Philistines are attacking our land." Saul had to break off his pursuit of David to go and fight the Philistines. David and his men escaped to live in the wilderness hills and caves around Engedi, near the Dead Sea. King Saul fought against the Philistines. Then, when told that David was in Engedi, he returned with 3,000 men to search for David. David and his men were hiding in a cave. King Saul needed to relieve himself and went alone into the cave in which David was hiding. David and his men were hiding far back in the cave. His men whispered, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said, 'I will put your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.'" David crept up, unnoticed, on King Saul. Instead of killing Saul, David cut off the edge of his robe without him noticing it. "The Lord forbid that I lay my hands on the king he has anointed," he told his men, and he stopped them attempting to kill Saul. David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My lord the king." When Saul looked around, David bowed down with his face to the ground. "The Lord gave you into my hands when you came into the cave, and my men wanted to kill you. But I spared your life as you are the Lord's anointed. Look at this piece of your robe I cut off. I have not wronged you, but you were hunting me down to take my life. May God judge and decide between us. May he deliver me from your hand." Saul asked, "Is that you, David?" And he wept aloud. "You are better than me," he said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. The Lord gave me into your hands, but you did not kill me." King Saul told David that he now knew that David would be the next king of Israel. He asked David not to kill his descendants or wipe out his family name when he became king. David promised he would not kill Saul's descendants. King Saul then returned home, but David stayed at Engedi. Samuel, the prophet, died in his old age and was buried in his hometown of Ramah. Sometime afterwards, the Philistines again made war on Israel. The Philistines brought their army to a place near Shunem. King Saul and his army went out to defend their country. They camped on Mount Gilboa, but when Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Saul tried to find out what the Lord wanted him to do, but the Lord gave no answer. So Saul foolishly decided to do something that God had strictly forbidden: visit a medium. That's a person who claims to be able to speak the spirits of the dead. Now King Saul had already outlawed all mediums from the land of Israel, but his servants knew that there was a woman living in Endor who was a medium. King Saul put on a disguise and went to see her. Saul said to her, "Speak to the spirits and call up the one I tell you." But the woman, a witch, was suspicious, fearing it was a trap. "Surely you know that the king has forbidden anyone to do that," she said. Saul promised her she would be safe. Then he asked her to call back the spirit of the prophet Samuel. When Saul heard Samuel's voice, he said, "I am in great trouble, Samuel. Tell me what I must do." Samuel replied, "As you have disobeyed the Lord, he has given your kingdom to David. The Philistines will defeat you, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." Saul was terrified. Just as Samuel said, the Philistines defeated the Israelites the next day. Many Israelites were killed, and the rest fled. The enemy captured Saul's sons, including Jonathan, and killed them. Saul was badly wounded by an arrow. Not wanting to be captured, he asked his armor-bearer to kill him, but the armor-bearer refused. So Saul killed himself by falling on his own sword. The next day, the Philistines found the bodies of Saul and his sons. They cut off Saul's head, then nailed his body and the bodies of his son to the wall of the city of Bethshan. When the Israelites who lived in Jabesh heard about this, some of their bravest men went to Bethshan and took down their bodies. They buried King Saul and his sons near a great tree in Jabesh. After David mourned for Saul and Jonathan, he moved to Hebron. The people of Judah came to him there and anointed him as their king. Later, he was anointed as king over all the tribes of Israel.